Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and traditions of Phi Delta Delta as we celebrate our Founders Week this week. We're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of Phi Alpha Delta's merger with Phi Delta Delta. So I think this is a good opportunity for us to talk about Phi Delta Delta and what that organization was. And what it meant to women who wanted to practice in practice law, which, if you think about it, it's still not necessarily an equal footing even today, but certainly when this organization was started, when Phi Delta Delta was started, it was an even more dismal picture for women who wanted to practice in the law. So let's talk about some of that stuff today. If anyone who's in the Zoom with us has any questions about anything or comments about anything or wants to discuss anything further, I'm happy to accommodate, because if you guys just listen to me for 45 minutes, you'll probably be really, really bored. So let's talk about Phi Delta Delta. So for most of our membership, literally all they know is this one line from our initiation ritual, that in 1972, Phi Delta Delta Law Fraternity, the leading law fraternity for women, was by joint resolution merged into Phi Alpha Delta, and 5,000 leading women, judges, lawyers, and law students became members of Phi Alpha Delta. So I don't know how many of us know on the call know more about that, but hopefully we will soon if we don't. So let's take that as a starting part. And I also wanted to point out that there are a lot of places where the two organizations kind of track. We both would be celebrating Founders Day this coming week. Phi Alpha Delta was founded on November 8th, 1902, and Phi Delta Delta was founded on November 11th, 1911. So we have 11-11-11, easy to remember. But they celebrated their Founders Day around the same time of the year as us every year that they were in existence. So I thought that was kind of cool. But I want to talk first about what it was like for women in the law when that organization was founded in 1911. So at the time and you think it's hard to get a Phi Alpha Delta chapter going and sustain now. Think about the challenges these women faced when they started Phi Delta Delta. Most law schools did not accept women in 1911. Many states still did not allow women to practice law at all. Law schools that did accept women had very few women enrolled generally, a very small percentage of their total student population. So even fewer actually practice law are occupied positions of authority in the profession. So even if women were fortunate to go to law school, there weren't opportunities for women who wanted to practice law. And certainly at that time, you didn't find women judges or women in high government positions or anything like that. In fact, in many states, women had only been recently allowed to own and manage their own property. In some states, in many states, women couldn't have make their own their loan arrangements, particularly if they were married. And at that time, women didn't even have the right to vote. The 19th Amendment didn't become law till 9 years later. So this is the environment that these women decided, we're going to start something to promote women in the law. We have some women law students now. They're facing a lot of challenges. They don't know what the profession is going to look like now. So we're going to act not only to advance the position of women in the legal profession, but to celebrate the women lawyers that are out there practicing, so that the women who want to practice have someone to look to and to use as role models. So that's sort of the environment in which Phi Delta Delta started. So today we're celebrating Phi Delta Delta. Unlike us, who have only the carnations, they had two flowers that were their fraternity flowers. And yes, even though it was an organization of women, they started with the name sorority. They changed that name just a few years into fraternity as an assertion of their equality with the male legal organizations. But Phi Delta Delta, I'm sharing a little cheer they had. You know, we have our Phi Alpha Delta cheers and chants and songs and stuff. So did Phi Delta Delta. This was their toast: to the need of women, the help of women, the friendship of women, we raise each glass. To the faith of women, the trust of women, the justice of women that shall not pass. While your candles flare with a gracious flame, and your 5 bright stars, and we'll talk about that later, burn just the same, and the daughters of women know your name, Phi Delta Delta. So this was really an important organization. You know, we talk about Phi Alpha Delta being started in the face of a legal controversy. And for those of you who want to look more on that, my video on the birth of Phi Alpha Delta is available on the YouTube channel. And goes even more in depth than the Judice history that's available. But this is an organization that started not just to deal with a controversy that was facing those members at that time, but this was something that was started to help face challenges that women in the law would be facing. Even now they're facing, because even though now women have a comparable or even higher enrollment in law schools, in the actual profession, they still only hold 37% of the jobs. And that percentage goes down at every level. If you're looking at people who own firms or people who manage or managing partners or in positions of authority, that number is still less. So I just think it's, as I studied the history of Phi Delta, I just think it's extraordinary what they were able to accomplish with the resources they had and in the environment they operated in.
And we do have a question from Nick Lee, if you have it to address now.
Sure, Nick.
I didn't know where it would be relevant, but you said something that sparked my curiosity. I've heard that the first member of Phi Delta Delta to join was Anna Hines from Knoxville, Tennessee. Being from Knoxville, Tennessee, I'm curious, is there any historical support to this, or do we not know off the top of our heads?
The first woman to join Phi Alpha Delta, you mean?
From Phi Delta Delta, yes. When they all joined in Moss.
No, I don't have anything to support that. The Judice history called her the first woman to join Phi Alpha Delta in general, and said she was initiated by Phi Alpha Delta, but the dates we show for her initiation were first, they're earlier than the merger, and they're later than at least 30 other women I've identified who were initiated with Phi Alpha Delta. So I think
that's something we might find out once we start delving more through the archives.
We don't take anything for granted. So any piece of information we do try to find multiple sources to verify. And I can tell you the Phi Alpha Delta records are not always accurate. And the information in the Judice history is not always accurate. So I look to verify information not only from Phi Alpha Delta records, believe it or not, although we don't get a lot of media coverage now for everything that fraternity happens. I spent a lot of time looking at, in addition to the university archives that I think were mentioned a little while ago, so university newspapers, university yearbooks, all that kind of stuff. I also look at general newspapers. You'll find particularly like in society columns, there's often news of fraternities and sororities and organizations like that, or the members of those organizations being initiated and stuff like that. So when, particularly if I see some conflict that one record shows one thing and one says another thing, I don't presume one record is right over the other. I do everything I can to find external confirmation.
That's all interesting to know. Thank you, brother.
Sure. So where did Phi Delta Delta get its start? Beginning in the fall of 1910, there were 6 women studying law at the University of Southern California, which at the time was one of the few Western full formal law schools. And here's a little picture. I think it's actually from a couple years after that, but it's the best I could find of the law school at USC. So around that time, USC was starting to get women law students. And these 6 women, since they didn't have access to some of the male organizations at the law school, started an informal group, a social circle, and they met every 2 weeks just to discuss how things were going, encourage each other. But one of the things they began to discuss was forming a legal sorority. At the time, they were calling it a sorority. And basically they were looking for the same type of organization that men had in the law that would help advance their careers. We talk about all the stuff Phi Alpha Delta does to help the students succeed, to provide professional networks. They were just looking for the same opportunities that the male students had. So this tells you what I was talking about the available women. By the following fall, 2 of those 6 women had left the school without completing their education. But the idea of organizing the sorority was still important to the remaining 4. So they tried to find a 5th member to get started. They found that 5th, and those founding members were Georgia Bullock, Annette Hunley, Gladys Moore, Vera Rader Norton, and Sarah Patton. And they set out to form what would become Phi Delta Delta. So beginning in the fall, they spent several months researching other organizations, how other sororities and fraternities were set up, and beginning to do all the groundwork for starting their own organization. So that means all the stuff that we take for granted because we've had for over 100 years, they had to do from scratch. They had to create a ritual, they had to choose a name, they wrote a constitution and bylaws. Their plan was to immediately incorporate it, so they had to draft and file articles of incorporation in Sacramento. They elected their charter officers. So there were 5 of them and 5 officers. So I imagine there wasn't a lot of contested election going on, but they chose what those officers would be and what their duties would be in the governing documents. And then they picked which office each of them would have. They designed sorority jewelry, and they actually had the jewelry made. And this is interesting, from the beginning, they planned to be an international organization. So everything was laid out in that very first draft of the Constitution, how new chapters could be formed, how international chapters could be formed, how those members could be joined, how women could join if there weren't chapters where they were as associate members. All that was really incredible foresight. You know, for those of you who are familiar with our own history know we're tinkering with our governing documents constantly every 2 years at convention, and we still haven't gotten it quite right. So we're still working on it, but they showed an amazing foresight. The provisions of those constitution and bylaws took into effect the situations they were facing, the limited enrollment of women in law schools, all that, the establishment of alumni chapters, which we didn't provide for alumni chapters. Actually, our first alumni chapters were in 1911, almost 10 years after Phi Alpha Delta was founded. They had those provisions already in their constitution and bylaws from day one. So after all these months of planning, they basically just announced, okay, we're a sorority now. We're Phi Delta Delta legal sorority. That's what it was originally known as. So they announced they've been established, and they started coming to school wearing their jewelry, which they already had. They got a lot of coverage in the time in various newspapers and in the university publications. And they immediately began, okay, what do we do to make this grow, both here and expanding into other schools? It was really quite an amazing thing. Here's a piece of that Phi Delta Delta jewelry. It's very lovely, I think. So these are just a couple pictures I wanted to share with you guys. That first chapter at USC, they called Alpha Chapter. I think their naming convention, from the beginning, we named our chapters after prominent attorneys, but they followed a more traditional social Greek organization system where they followed the Greek alphabet. So the first chapter was the Alpha Chapter, the second chapter, the Beta Chapter, etc., all the way to Omega, Alpha through Omega chapters. And once they got to the end of the Greek alphabet, they start again with 2 letters for the names. So the Alpha Alpha Chapter, the Alpha Beta Chapter, etc., through Alpha Omega, and then starting again. Which is maddening when you're trying to find information, because so many organizations use those various combinations of Greek letters that when you're searching by the Greek names of Phi Delta Delta and Phi Alpha Delta, you get so many false positives because they find various combinations of those letters in so many different organizations. But this picture is from 1912. So this is the 5 founders and their first initiates that joined after them. So as you can see, they were off to a leaping start, and you can see they had a fine sense of style for the time. But this is that first group at the end of 1 year at USC. So this is where it all started with Phi Delta Delta, and we saw from that line in the ritual that eventually it'll grow to 5,000 leading women judges, lawyers, and law students. So I want to talk a little bit more about these challenges I talked about. So this is from the 1911 bylaws. So this is an immediate difference you see in how the organizations are set up. They knew there weren't going to be enough students at most of the schools to sort of man the chapters. I guess I shouldn't say man the chapters, to fill out the chapter rosters. So their chapters at the law schools were made up of both students and graduates of the schools. And even at the school level, the school graduates could serve as officers of the chapter. So there had to be at least 5, which is a pretty low number. And even then, at a lot of schools, they couldn't hit that unless they included graduates. So the law school chapters had both alumni members and student members who served as part of the active membership and were served as officers and were elected. And the reason this was necessary, because there were times that literally there'd be a chapter someplace and there were no female students at the school for a while. So I actually pulled to show this. These are excerpts from actual minute books from a Kappa chapter, which was at Washburn University, home of our Benson chapter. So all these members we're talking about eventually would become members of Benson chapter. But these minute entries show a couple times when the chapter was facing problems. And you see this first one talks about, we met to discuss the future of the chapter because there are no girls here. So these are the chapter officers of this chapter who now are all alumni members because there are no law students at the school who are women. And I read through these entries and they contacted the national office and they said, well, I say office loosely, they contacted the national officer and said, what should we do? Should we just dissolve the chapter and start an alumni chapter? Because all the women attorneys here are graduates. There are no law students. And they were told, no, it's better for us to preserve the chapter at the law school, so for our long-term growth. So the chapter had all alumni officers and no law student members. You see that kind of thing repeating itself through the history when there were so many law school closures, for example, during World War II, where even the male law fraternities couldn't stay active because there were no students. Their student chapters stayed active, run by alumni members, and some of their members of the alumni chapters would actually resign their membership in the alumni chapter and rejoin the student chapters, so the student chapters didn't go inactive. So it's really an amazing thing. The next one is a similar entry, but a couple of years later, there's only one female student in the law school. So they were facing a similar thing. What do we do? But so it's amazing. And Kappa chapter, by the way, stayed active all the way from its founding in 1920 through the merger. And you'll hear some interesting stories about Kappa and Benson chapter. And when I talk about if any of you watch the video or are present when I talk about removing gender restrictions, because Benson chapter played kind of an interesting role in that development. So despite all these challenges, this organization continues to grow. Almost immediately, they start expanding. So 2 new chapters are almost immediately installed in 1913. So within 2 years of founding, they're already expanding. So Beta chapter at Washington College of Law, which is now the law school at American University, and Gamma chapter at Chicago Kent College of Law. Remember, we're going through the Greek letters: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, etc. So now we talk about one of the things that gets me excited about doing historical work. So now we have a little mystery. Gamma chapter was started at Chicago Kent Law. And this is all I found about it so far, literally these 4 lines in Phi Delta Delta magazine, that there was a chapter installed at Kent College of Law in Chicago in April 1913, which is the home of our grand chapter, Blackstone chapter. The president of Phi Delta Delta installed the chapter after installing Beta, and that because of dissension in the group, the charter was revoked and Gamma was struck from the roll of the chapters. So all I've been able to find out is apparently Gamma, you'll see this a lot, where As they're expanding, there's already groups of women organizing at the law school to basically for survival almost. You see at a lot of law schools, there are groups called Portia clubs, which are named after Portia from The Merchant of Venice, from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. I don't know how many of you are Shakespearean aficionados, but Portia was a woman who pretended to be a man in order to argue a legal case, because of course women couldn't be lawyers. And she won her case, sort of. It's a little more complicated than that. But so she was taken by early women lawyers and law students as sort of a symbol of women breaking into the practice of law. So a lot of law schools had these Portia clubs, and a lot of law schools started forming local sororities for women. That was the case at Kent College of Law. The chapter there existed as it's a local sorority. And they had, apparently there was a deal that those, in order to affiliate with a larger group, they were going to convert to Phi Delta Delta. So whatever happened, it didn't work out. They broke out on their own. And I believe that chapter then started growing and became Kappa Beta Phi, which was Phi Delta Delta's biggest competitor, another legal sorority. And you'll see they first focused on growing in Chicago. So in its history, there was never again a chapter of Phi Delta Delta in a Chicago law school, because Kappa Beta Phi expanded in all the Chicago law schools, and there were never enough women for two different women's law fraternities to function. So I would love to find out more about that history, and that's one of the things that's on my list to explore more as we continue to learn. So some of you who are familiar with our Phi Alpha Delta history know that when our fraternity was founded, it was there was actually a prior fraternity that was founded first that didn't work out. One of the things that caused problems in that prior fraternity was that as chapters were added, they didn't like the setup, because the original constitution and bylaws of Lambda Epsilon provided for that first chapter, the grand chapter, Blackstone chapter, would sort of run the show, and they wouldn't have a convention to change the way things were run until there were at least 12 subordinate chapters. Those of you who follow my Instagram know, as soon as another chapter was founded, they started rebelling against it and demanding that there be a convention, and things changed. In Phi Delta Delta, they provided that there wouldn't be a convention until there were 5 chapters. So they hit the 5 chapter mark with the chartering of Delta and Epsilon at the University of Oregon and the University of Washington. And they held their first convention in 1917. So from the beginning of the fraternity, or as it was then called the sorority, in 1911 to 1917, the same 5 founders were the national officers. The officers at Alpha chapter changed each year, but they were the national officers until that first convention in 1917. So I'm not going to go through the history of every single chapter, but we have a great resource if you are interested in learning where each chapter was found, when it was found, who the charter members were, those kind of little information. Phi Delta Delta was their publication, their quarterly publication. Part of the deal when we merged was that money was set aside in their treasury to produce one last issue of Phi Delta Delta. That issue includes a roll of all the chapters and who their charter members were. And that is available through our executive office, which has imaged that final issue, and it's available on the fraternity website on the history page. So it's a good read. I don't know if you noticed, by the way, I've switched from the Phi Alpha Delta colors of purple and gold as we go along to the Phi Delta Delta colors of violet and pink. So let's go through that expansion just a little bit. Remember the situation they're facing. Low female enrollment in law schools, low number of law schools that even accept females, but the chapter continued to grow. So it started in 1911 with 5 members, more than doubled in 1912. By 1923, they had almost 200 members. In 1929, there were 800 members. In 1936, over 1,500 members. In 54, 2,660 members. And then by the time of the merger, it had doubled again to about 5,000 members. So in the face of all this adversity and challenges, even at existing chapters where there are no students, these chapters just continue to sprout up, and the organization continued to grow. So some of the things that they did to help advance women, beginning in 1924, they established their own endowment fund. Those of you who are familiar with our foundation's history, it was actually started as the Phi Alpha Delta Endowment Fund. And its principal function, the Phi Alpha Delta Endowment Fund, was to provide emergency assistance to members in the form of low interest loans. And that's all it was still doing for even when I joined only 30 some years ago. I remember my district justice used to talk, when he'd talk about the endowment fund and what they could do if you had an emergency and needed assistance. He always gave the example that Johnny Cochran had been one of our, had gotten an emergency loan from the endowment fund. And then he always followed up by, and he paid it back. But that's what our endowment fund did. They also had an endowment fund that was used to provide scholarship assistance for their members. Remember, the biggest challenge facing women was being able to get into law school, stay there, and get out and graduate. So that's what they used their endowment fund for. And at the time of the merger, there was still $17,000 in the fund, and that was turned over to Phi Alpha Delta. So that's one of the things they did to help the women. They had a professional advisory committee that was established to assist members after graduation to establish themselves in the, and this was the phrasing, in the actual practice of law. Because back then, even if you could actually get through law school, it was very difficult for one to get employment as a lawyer. The whole point of this group at Phi Delta Delta was to help women establish themselves in the practice of law and help them ascertain how they could best use their legal training. So this is an organization, again, that's fighting for women to have a place in the law.
BJ, is there anything from Phi Delta Delta showing any of their involvement in the right to vote, and if they did that kind of work?
I have not seen it, but I don't doubt that there is. One of the things that Corey's worried about me wanting to steal, but I just want to read them, is there are apparently 2 places that had an entire run of Phi Delta Delta magazine in bound editions. One is the University Library at USC, and one is the Phi Alpha Delta Executive Office. So I'm guessing that's still available in the executive office somewhere in storage, and only that last issue is available in imaged form. I'd love to get access to those and to do more research on the group's history. Because one of the other things that I see even in this final issue that's been digitized is they would post articles about women's advancing positions, identifying women who had made achievements in the area of law. And this is another thing I wanted to talk about at this point is, we pride ourselves on Phi Alpha Delta that we call ourselves a fraternity of first. The first fraternity to remove racial restrictions, the first fraternity to remove gender restrictions, all these things that we were the first at. But let's look at, if we want to talk about the fraternity first, look at this fraternity, because they were the first at everything. If you read through, if you research some of those lists of founding members of the different chapters and actually try to, which I've done, search for them in old newspapers and stuff, you see the first women prosecutor in the country was a Phi Delta Delta. In many counties, the first judges, women judges, were Phi Delta Delta members. First appointed to various first women appointed to various high-level government positions, Phi Delta Deltas. I think a great project to take on at some point would just be to try to identify those lists of what these women accomplished in this environment, and one of the things I'm going to try to do on my Instagram account is, when I get that kind of information, is posted so we can learn about these members, because we don't talk about them, you know. And in our history, it talks mainly about the principal figures of Phi Alpha Delta. But the figures of Phi Delta Delta history, that's our history too, because our organizations merged and those people all became Phi Alpha Delta members. And we want credit for all the great things they did, right? we shouldn't forget, because they did do amazing things. So the paragraphs on this page are actually taken from that last issue of Phi Delta Delta magazine. It's sort of a tribute. Look what's happened and our part in it. So again, they talk about the same kind of stuff I did. In 1911, only a few law schools admitted women. By 1972, at the end of our organization, women are admitted to all law schools in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And women now have the ability to study law in all civilized countries throughout the world. In 1911, many states in the United States did not admit women to the bar. Some states did not permit women to sit on a jury. The foreman of the first all-woman jury in Indiana, by the way, was a Phi Delta Delta member. She was also the first woman judge and the same person in Indiana. No woman held a judicial position in 1911. No woman held a governmental position requiring a law degree. Many states denied women property rights, and even some states denied women rights to their own children. Hopefully that's not coming back. In 1911, women could not vote in the United States, and the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the 19th, was not proclaimed a part of the Constitution until 1920. Phi Delta Delta has contributed greatly to the slow but sweeping advancement that has brought women to the point of achieving equal rights with men in the United States. So much so that, to the great amazement, shock, and surprise of Phi Delta Delta, the men in Phi Alpha Delta have invited Phi Delta Delta to join their ranks. After great accomplishments, Phi Delta Delta merged with Phi Alpha Delta on August 12, 1972. So even these women understood what they were doing. It was a plan to promote women, and it was working. You know, obviously they're not responsible for every advancement that women made in the law or otherwise, but they played a part, and I think that's a part that's worth remembering. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the differences in the way they organized. Oops. So I'm sorry, I've somehow moved the pictures of all you guys and it's blocking my screen. There we go. So these are the chapter officers of Phi Delta Delta chapter. When we established how we were organized and what we called our officers, we tried to make it sound like a judicial organization, right? Justice, vice justice, clerk. They went a little different way, and they gave it more like a religious feel. So their chapter justice and vice justice were their chapter high priestess and priestess. Their clerk was the registrar. And I really think the reason their clerk was the registrar is because one of the founders served as registrar at USC Law School. Their treasurer was called a chancellor, and their marshal was called a chaplain. And the chaplain was the person responsible for the ritual, administering oaths and stuff, which is what our marshal's position originally did. So this is a picture of Phi Alpha Delta officers demonstrating the initiation ritual at their 1952 convention. So you see, it's a little different flavor. They're not wearing judicial robes. They're wearing robes that are more similar to like a priestess robes, right? So that's interesting. So if you ever hear, you know how sometimes our chapter justices will say they're president of the chapter because people don't know what they mean when they say justice. These had to say they were priestess of the chapter. So they had a coat of arms just like we do, and you can see there's a lot of similarity in the coat of arms. They have scales of justice, a lamp, but there are some differences, and we talk about their values. So the first thing you see is there's a picture of a profile of a woman, and some of you may recognize it as a significant art piece, but this is Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She was considered the patroness of the fraternity. There are 5 stars surrounding. Remember when we read that poem at the beginning? It talked about the 5 bright stars of Phi Delta Delta. Those are the five bright stars, and each one of them represented one of their core values. So like in Phi Alpha Delta, we talk about integrity and compassion and courage and professionalism and service, etc. These were their core values, and they were each represented by one of these bright stars. I think also the founders meant them to represent them, but that's just me saying it. So those 5 stars represent the 5 core virtues of Phi Delta Delta: love, loyalty, truth, justice, and wisdom. And just as in our ritual, their ritual had the chapter officers explaining what they meant by those virtues as part of the ritual. So these are excerpts from the Phi Delta Delta book of the ritual. This is something that drives you guys nuts who've had to do Phi Alpha Delta ceremonies. They weren't allowed to use the book of the ritual at the ceremonies. The chapter officers were expected to memorize the ritual and do it from heart during the initiations. So this talks about what those different core values were and what they meant in terms of the members of Phi Delta Delta. So love doesn't mean romantic love. It means thoughtfulness for others, gentleness, strength, patience, and faithfulness, which is probably why they put up with the same set of national officers for that first 10-year period, right? Until they got 5 chapters. Loyalty is what we talk about. It's really what we talk about when we talk about the bond of fraternalism, right? It's that loyalty to each other that makes us put personal desires aside in favor of the group. So that's like our ritual when we open a meeting and close a meeting. You know, we put aside any differences that may arise because we're brothers and sisters in Phi Alpha Delta, we're siblings. So the bond takes care of that for us, right? We don't hold grudges. We don't dwell on these differences that may arise. And so on for truth, justice, and wisdom. So like us, they had a set of core values. They talked about in the rituals, and their initiates had to subscribe to these core values. The coat of arms beneath the stars and the patroness goddess is the shields, where we see some of the same symbols that we see on our coat of arms, and they describe them a little differently. So they're the shield is split into 3 parts. One has the scales of justice, balancing truth and power, is the way it was phrased in the ritual. They call their lamp the lamp of learning, as if, and then they had the open book, where we call it the book of law. And this is a really great thing. So you see the book is open and there's actual writing in it. You can't read most of it, but you see Greek words at the top of each page. At the top of the page to the left is phos, which means light or knowledge. And the second page is nomos, which means law. Now, I don't know, because we've kind of lost the use of it, how many of you know this, but there is a password for Phi Alpha Delta that's supposed to never be committed to writing. They also had passwords in Phi Delta Delta that weren't supposed to be committed in writing. So there's a place in their written rituals where it says, our national password is, and literally it doesn't even say it in the ritual, it's left blank, and our chapter password is this. But this is where I thought it was kind of a hoodwink, because I happen to know what those passwords were. They were phos and nomos. So even though they weren't allowed to commit in writing, they talk about it in their ritual, and it's written right on their coat of arms. So I always think of it like in the Lord of the Rings, when the Fellowship gets to Moria and they're trying to figure out how to open the door, and it says, say friend and enter, and they're trying to figure out what the password is, and the password is friend. So it says right there and no one sees it. So I just think that's funny. So I appreciate the sense of humor for these founding members of the Phi Delta Delta fraternity. So then they have the wreath of oak leaves, which stands for strength. And on the scroll beneath is written Phi Delta Delta in Greek letters. So very similar to what we have. So now this next part is another mystery we have to solve. But we'll talk about those Greek letters in a second. So this is a imaged book of the ritual for Phi Delta Delta. The University of Florida has this in their archives. And you see there's a warning on each page that this initiation and pledge are secret. And this booklet must be kept in a place where none but Phi Delta Delta will have access. So Phi Delta Delta is Phi Alpha Delta now because of the merger, so you guys are allowed access. But they were very big on this traditional secret society, where we have an open ritual that we allow the public to attend. For them, it was just the members of the fraternity who could participate. So here's this little mystery I was talking about. Like we say, Phi Alpha Delta. Phi Alpha Delta connotes the Greek phrase philos adelphos dikaios, which I think Nick was using as his screen name a little while ago. And that stands for, the Phi Delta Delta letters stand for, their ritual didn't say what it stood for, because it was considered one of their high mysteries that only members could know. And God forbid the ritual should get out, it's not committed to writing. But then, like we do in our ritual, they say what that phrase means. It means we receive light as a gift, is the literal meaning, or the esoteric meaning. For the bounty of knowledge, we look to the Father of light. So that's like we do, right? We say, justice is a dear brother, or in another translation, it's that same kind of rhythm and stuff in the ritual, which I find fascinating. But I want to know what that phrase is. So that's another mystery for me. I got to get to the answer. So I was actually speaking last week to Professor Linda Elrod at Washburn, because she was one of those final members of Kappa chapter at Phi Delta Delta. And she's helped me out before with learning about some of the stuff that was going on with removal of gender restrictions and how that played out. And I said, hey, I don't know if you feel comfortable telling me this, but we're all one fraternity now. And I think I provided her with this quote, and I said, do you remember what the phrase means? And her answer was, no. So hopefully that's not lost forever, because no one living remembers it. But we'll see if we can't get to the bottom of this. I even sat with Google Translator trying to find different Greek words that began with the P, D, and D sound that could come close to that meaning. So I did, like, in my mind, decide what the phrase could have been, but since I have no basis for it, I'm not sharing that. But by golly, I'm going to find someone who remembers and is still with us and able to talk. So we'll see what we can find out. So in 1970, which if you're interested in learning more about how that came about, I'll talk about in a few hours, Phi Alpha Delta amended its constitution to remove the gender restrictions on membership. At the same convention, Phi Alpha Delta resolved to extend an invitation to women's law fraternities and sororities to merge with it. So here's an awareness on the part of Phi Alpha Delta. Part of our debate about removing gender restrictions was, hey, by the way, if we do this, the women's organizations will die because there aren't enough women to go around. We have a bigger network. We can do more for them. They'll join our fraternity instead of the existing fraternities. And we see that's true. But it's kind of sad because, I've gotten, if you can tell, I've gotten kind of excited about what Phi Delta Delta was and what they did. So it's kind of sad to know that what was progress for us really was, basically the death knell for them. So we extended that information, that invitation, and after 2 years of work, the conventions of Phi Alpha Delta and Phi Delta Delta were held concurrently in San Diego. Phi Delta Delta actually moved the location of their convention that year, and the timing slightly to match with Phi Alpha Delta's. So literally the two organizations had their conventions at the same hotel in San Diego, the Town and Country, which you see here. And they had formed a committee on the merger to talk about how that would work, and it was debated on the floor. And by joint resolution, the two organizations merged effective August 12th, the last day of convention.
Oh, to give you a fun fact, BJ, a lot of our fraternity, a lot of our legal profession here in San Diego, we still have a lot of our meetings at the Town and Country.
Oh, excellent.
So that's still a very prominent place for legal activity here in San Diego.
Well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that merger and how it works in my session later today when I'm sort of generally talking about removal of gender restriction, because I'll culminate my talks in that merger. But so this year, because it's 50 years after the fact, we're celebrating that merger with Phi Delta Delta, and hopefully celebrating what Phi Delta Delta was and what it meant to women, particularly women in the law. And I'd really like to improve our appreciation of that history and that organization and the women that made it up. So hopefully this little presentation and putting this video on will do, and the other things we're doing this week will help with that. But I definitely think that it's a history that's worth exploring and learning more about, and particularly the women and the accomplishments they made and advancing women's rights in the legal profession. So hopefully you'll all go out there and help me do this research, and anything you find, send my way, because I'd love to know it. So that's all I had about Phi Delta Delta for today. Trust me, my work continues, and hopefully we'll be identifying other people who are Phi Delta Delta members that can help us with that work, getting access to other records at different universities, getting access to whatever we may have stored at the executive office at some point to flesh this out. And I'd love for ultimately to have a more complete version of our official history that tracks the history of Phi Delta Delta right alongside our Phi Alpha Deltas. So long-term projects, I plan to keep working on our history forever. So if it means I can't die, so be it. Immortality will be accepted. So later this afternoon, I'm going to be back. Not that I'm jumping off immediately, but for those of you who are interested, I'm going to talk about how Phi Alpha Delta started as a restrictive membership and how we gradually moved to remove those restrictions. So I hope some of you will be back and we can share in that discussion, and hopefully the fraternity will be continuing to strive to become more diverse and more inclusive as we go forward into the future.